Cool.
Okay, I think part of what we have been looking at, has to do with the fact that Soweto at the time had actually been a community of families. And these were families, to a large extent, that came out of different historical processes that would have gone back to before the Second World War, during the war, and after the war. The most important character of these families is that they were nuclear families, but at the same time, some of these, the majority of them, would have either developed within the townships themselves. So that, by 1976, if you are looking at, people in Orlando East, by 1976, they would have had about 40 years within which to construct, such a family. And therefore, we have a sense of, the age groups, within each and every family that we are thinking about. Or at least we can have a sense of the average age groups that one finds in different families. So that by the outbreak of the unrest in 1976, we do have a clear sense, of the fact that the elder, part of children in any family would probably be at that time in employment, and they would have had their entire lives, growing up in the cities. And they would be in employment along with the parents. What was typical here was that the women were actually stay-at-home mothers, and it is the fathers generally who were employed. Now, what is important about the 1980s is that by the end of the 1970s, going into the 1980s, that kind of family structure, that one finds in Soweto that had been building up, for the past 40 years, is beginning to disintegrate. And, the usual family becomes one in which, there is a significant presence, of grandchildren. But there is also a significant presence of elderly males or adult males who are beyond the school-going age, but are at the same time not employed. In many cases, they would have been employed before. And in some cases, they may have been employed beyond the age that they were employed in 1976, 1977. But going into the 1980s, the preference of employers was beginning to change quite dramatically, particularly in the PWV area. And this has to be understood. It is the one subject that has never been dealt with, quite satisfactorily in the literature and in academics.
To be sure on that, I mean, the period that you're referring to is also an economic transition away from industrial capitalism to a more globalized financial capitalism occurring around the same time, and explaining precisely why you'd have that there. Yes, sure.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
But at the same time, that would be, the one period where, instances of unemployment begin to emerge.
Yes.
And it is that older, generation of township folks, who are being impacted upon. There is something else that has not been dealt with, which is something that I wanted to bring out here. There was a change of preference, in terms of the employers. And this was not only in one industry. Again, this actually happens in that transitional period, between 1978 and 1983. In the workplaces, there is an eagerness on the part of employers to get rid of what they consider, to be klapgooiers or stone throwers. And these are people who had been in the workplace, probably going into 1976 and 1977. And suddenly they are no longer desirable in the workplace, which is why commented earlier, and I said institutionally, that residual 1976, the class of 76, 77 was being taken out of the public sphere. So very gradually, systematically, but suddenly, they were being taken out of the workplace. And their place was being taken, and this is going to sound very controversial, but their place was actually being taken by people who were newly arrived in the urban areas, not from Mozambique, not from Zimbabwe, not from Nigeria, but from parts of South Africa, and specific parts of South Africa that were generating, that level of that labor at that age, and in some cases it was actually families moving to the PWV area, which then began to explain in the townships the proliferation of two-room and a garage. Two-room and a garage in a standard Soweto family house was not to accommodate additional members of the family. The two-room and garage was to be rented out to outsiders, and which in itself would tell you that over time, it were people coming from outside, as opposed to the residual population of Soweto.
Yes.
Residual from the 1976-77 movement. These are people who did not go to exile, who were not on Robben Island, but they were not in the workplace because they were no longer desirable. And like I said earlier, the males become the legendary, unemployed township uncle.
I think
the females become the single mothers.
I figure for purposes of the discussion here, we may be remiss if we don't underscore the Vihan and Celia's commission and the lifting of influx control and what that would have done. Yes, please.
And the Dumlora here reminds me of this very important legislative intervention, that not only makes this process possible, but actually encourages it. And I know using these terms would be rather unsavory, for some and most South Africans. But here was a situation where, just in terms of apartheid terminology, we can break down the black society of this period into two, maybe into three, but two most distinct groups would be what the apartheid terminology referred to as the detribalized Bantu. Now, what that actually meant is that this was a cohort of black society that, to put it bluntly, did not have a Bantustan homestead to return to. And this is a result or a function of historical processes we have dealt with in this program, delineating that cohort of black society. And it is that cohort that creates what I call the old location culture. The old location culture of Guatemala, of Orlando, of Mohlake. That's the old, and these are the people who are now being targeted to be taken out of the public sphere. And therefore that is how this demographic changes. But what makes it possible? It is that legislation that Ndadimulora is referring to here. It has to do with the influx control regulations. You could speak of no unemployment in Soweto between 1960 and 1975, because people who should be unemployed are actually in the Bantustans and not allowed to come to Soweto. So yes, you will have full employment. But once you open the borders, as they did with the scrapping of the influx control regulations, people were coming, swarming into Soweto, into Soshanguve, into Mamelodi, into Tembisa, in ever-growing numbers from 1979 until 1984. That was, in fact, a wave of migration into the cities.
It does.
And it is for that reason that I'm saying that wave was actually being weaponized to take the detribalized Bantu out of the public sphere. Yeah.
Yes, in fact, you actually made the point that I was attempting to underscore here, that this conscious here, that apartheid hitherto had influx controls precisely to bar urbanization from the
Yes.
countryside. At this point here, it suddenly lifts this up,
Yes.
unplanned, no houses, no infrastructure in the township to accommodate this population, and there's an air of orchestration here, isn't it? That's what you're saying.
Which is why I refer to it as a demographic social engineering exercise.
Right.
This is what it was. But at the same time, it was weaponizing this new way against the established, black people in the townships, and to marginalize them in that way. I've always argued, that colleges of education that were established in 1979, 1980 required a matric certificate, but Soweto never had a matric exam being administered at any time between 1976 and 1981.
Wow.
There was no credible matric exam that was administered. So when you have students applying for admission at Soweto College of Education in 1982, and they have matric, they are not coming from Soweto.
Yes.
They are actually coming from elsewhere other than Soweto. That actually explains that the cohort of teachers that you have in Soweto in the 1980s do not have any institutional memory of the 1970s movement, precisely because they were not there in the 1970s.
They are from another world entirely.
They are from an entirely different world. And one can bravely say the South African Democratic Teachers Union was precisely of that character. But the issue here is that the political culture of the mass movement of the 70s is completely cancelled, and a new political culture is actually being instituted. But it is unfair. In academic terms, they speak about the popular violence of 1984 to 1993. By that, they actually mean that violence, that defined, the political upheavals of the 1980s actually began in 1984. But it is my assertion that it actually began in 1983 with the Ngoye massacre. That is where it actually begins. And it is precisely because, of the Ngoye massacre. When one looks at Ngoye massacre, it actually establishes the character of the political, upheavals of the next decade. Because what happens here, and this is something that we need to explain here, Gachagua did not appear from nowhere and decided that he was going to destabilize, because what Gachagua was doing was to destabilize, the resistance movement, if you like, because at this stage it is pretty difficult to characterize it, because it is in the process of becoming a mass democratic movement, and the UDF is just about being established. And this is important, because part of what we are looking at here are developments leading to the formation of the UDF. The question that you asked, about the Wehan Commission has to do also with the creation of trade unions, that the government actually was advised, by American experts that it would pay off if they were to allow trade unions to operate freely, because then it would actually, be able to deflect, future kinds of opposition away from the central issue here, which would have been race, to a completely different kind of antagonism, which has to do with the workplace. And well, of course, the government decided that, okay, trade unions are legalized.
As a safety valve, if you will.
And it was, in fact, a safety valve. But what is also significant is that in some cases, the trade unions were actually the initiative of employers,
Yes.
as opposed to
Yes.
actually being the demand of the working class.
Right.
So they were actually being created by employers so as to facilitate, good relationships between the workers and management. And that would have been the reason why they were established. If later down the line, the unions decided to turn against management, that became another matter. But initially, when they were allowed, when they were vetted and allowed to operate, that would have been the kind of an arrangement.
But you're making that this shift in political culture was undergirded in turn by broadly a shift in culture as a whole, in township culture, the old location culture.
Yes,
And you're saying that, and this is the demographic,
demographic also, because precisely,
yes, the demographic influx is
so
making all
what
this possible,
crystallizes-
right?
What crystallizes as township culture in the 80s is not actually a reflection of the township personality, if you like. As it's not historical. It's a creation of the 80s in the same way. It is a creation that happens in a situation where that residual demographic is being marginalized, and therefore it is not actually impacting on the township.
We're no longer in the age of benign apartheid neglect. This is specifically a curated expression.
Yeah.
Right.
And one in which engagement is heightened.
Yes. So in this regard, total strategy. People like in the music sphere, what would happen? Who is Artie van Wyk? How do these things? How do this figure? Township expression and culture is being sculpted, you see, by the powers that be. Can you give a sense?
Yes. And Ziggy, this one would be particularly interesting to you because part of what is happening as this transition happens, it happens across all spheres of life. It happens in sports, it happens in soccer, it happens in theater. And let's start with theater because it also happens in music, although a lot of people may not want to hear this. When you think about Harare in the period 1975 to 1979, you get a kind of, even if it's not the sound, but there is a culture around Harare that is so much deeply embedded in the township. It is something that we relate to. And the language that actually goes around, is the language, that connects us to the group. I mean, I actually come from Dikloof, and, Selbintuli would have been, a kind of an icon, that we actually identified with very strongly. But part of what one begins to see in terms of music as well, in the aftermath of Black Wednesday, is that there is a shift away from the township, to other locations, and this has to do with the promise of sponsorship more than anything else. It is money that actually begins to attract, people away from the township. It is at this stage that you begin to have someone like Artie van Wyk, beginning to play a critical role in the making of black music. And, artists like Chico needed to be connected to Artie van Wyk, for their music to be lucrative, to be able to generate something. But more importantly, and this is something that we do not discuss, sufficiently, before Black Wednesday, it was, townships, we had theater. Every Friday at Dikloof Hall, we'd have Gibson Kente with Ladoma, Gibson Kente with, township theater, it was there. Even Credo Mutra would actually have his own, drama, Nosilimela, and we went and saw Nosilimela. Township theater was alive, and it is something that we were able to relate to. But the aftermath of Black Wednesday saw township theater actually dying, and market theater appropriating what was township theater for itself. All the productions were now going to market theater. And if you think about the 1980s, the 1980s was, there was no township theater in the 1980s at all. If you wanted to see theater, you have to go to market theater. Maybe after 1994, things have actually become better. But there's another added dimension to, this was an imperialistic appropriation of township art. And I know Dumandlov may not like this, But he went to New York, and Woza Albert was in fact, again, even Woza Albert itself, it was actually never shown at Mufullo Hall, or at Uncle Tom's Hall. By the time Woza Albert was made, it was Market Theatre where it could be shown. And thereafter it went to Broadway. And this is what we are not beginning to understand, that it was depriving township communities of their own productions. But the interesting thing here is that, particularly with theater, it is not only the Americans who became interested in this, the Germans, and we're talking here about Germany at the time when it was divided between East and West. And it is the West Germans who were particularly interested in South African black theater. Matsimela Managa presented his things in Germany so many times. He was actually, they wanted him at all times. In Sweden, that's where the theater went to, and the townships were starved of theater.
Yeah.
But the issue here is that the migration began, with market theater as the attraction, and that led to
my suspicion,
decimation of township theater.
My suspicion here is that you are being deliberately coy here. I mean, you were intimately involved in the black consciousness culture as a member of Modupi. I said that's your alma mater, the Modupi Arts Collective. Is that the correct description?
Yes,
yeah. So it would go some way towards substantiation of your point to give a sense of the black sphere. You talked earlier of Harare. You know what I'm saying? It was Harare, for crying out loud, not the beaters. You see, there had been a process of radicalization between the beaters. Zamparanyana. Is that beaters game paranyana? No, the beaters. I mix up the early 70s. I'm trying to make the case of a transition from precisely in the old location culture from the early 70s into the mid 70s, and how black society as a whole, you see, the old township was implicated. This was no mere politics. It permeated and percolated black social life and sensibility, and involved us all, if you will, and were carried along with it. So I'm trying to get this sense, because this understanding is crucial for preparing for what happened in the 80s, precisely the attempts to deprive black people of their life. Do you see what I'm saying? And instead supplant it with another product.
Exactly.
You see, so
in fact, one would even add that the theater did not even have to be explicitly political in what it articulated. It is in fact the atmosphere that it actually created, precisely what you are talking about. The kind of oneness, that it was able to forge, among people, and that was absolutely critical. But there was a political content to it as well. I mean, Medupi Writers Association was actually a deliberately and consciously political formation, and here we're actually doing poetry and prose. And the most significant thing is that at Biko's funeral, we recited a poem, Africa My Beginning, Africa My Ending. And I was actually part of the Voice of Medupi. We called ourselves the Voice of Medupi. And we did this with Imwapele Madiwan, who was actually the poet. He actually wrote that. So the issue here is that theater, when seen, theater, music, and arts and culture, seen in those terms, they played a very critical political role, and they had to be dealt with. And it is also significant that Medupi Writers Association was one of those organizations banned, on October the 19th. So it was significant, in that sense.
I think your initial objective was to make the point that Black Wednesday was not merely an assault on the media and media freedom, but rather an assault on black consciousness and the black consciousness movement. I think we could graduate that a stage further. It was the beginnings of the assault on black society as such. Yes. Do you see?
I think we have actually been making this point, and each time Black Wednesday comes, we harp on it. We want to remind South Africa that Black Wednesday was not about Percy Qoboza. It wasn't about Donald Woods, but it was about the Black mass movement of the 1970s. And, and here we need to point out milestones. When those guys sat down and decided that we are going to ban these Black organizations, they actually looked at what had actually happened in the immediate past. And there are milestones that had been overlooked in history. I did actually talk about this once, but maybe it is worth repeating here. It is well and good, to represent the 1976 narrative as one of victimhood by singling out Hector Peterson. But the big issue here was the brutal murder of Dr. Melville Adelstein. And the issue here is that in and of itself would have registered once again in the white psyche. And white society had to deal with that brutal murder, throughout that period. And when Black Wednesday comes, that is one of the issues that's on the table. That is what white society is actually dealing with. And there are other moments, when white society was awoken to the fact that there is a possibility of violence that might come from Black people. But here is an issue. The reason why all of these moments, which are themselves very, which would be transformative, maybe I'm using a wrong term here, but they would have been transformative just in terms of the ways in which Black people look at white people. But once you begin to mention this, the issue here becomes you are glorifying violence. The issue is violence a moral or is it an immoral activity to undertake? That's the one thing that we are unable to deal with. The reason why Black people are comfortable with Melville Edelstein being written out of history is because they do not want to take responsibility for having taken a white life. Now, that is something that has always, hindered a kind of discourse. The reason why we are still wondering why Sobukwe was so unpopular, it is because we are unable to link Sobukwe to Boko. Because if we do that, we are linking Sobukwe to a bunch of murderers. Boko would kill white people for merely being white people. And we do not want to associate Sobukwe with this. But what we are actually overlooking here is that, it is bad record keeping, to actually delete Boko out of history because it is that uncomfortable to discuss it. It is bad record keeping to take Edelstein out of history because it is uncomfortable to do so. We are taking Wellington Chazibane out of history because what defines him is the violence. But this is yet another moment that the white seculocrats looked at and decided they had to institute Black Wednesday. Again, Wellington contributed to this decision, and they had to deal with it. So it is collectively, in their totality, those milestones, in Black-white relationships, that would have informed the white seculocrats to institute Black Wednesday. It had absolutely nothing to do with Percy Qoboza and Donald Woods. But let's also be realistic about this. What was the role of the media? We don't even have to go back to 1968. Let's look at the moment of political catharsis, 1976. What was the role of the media? What was the world, the weekend world, the Star, the Daily Mail? What were they reporting on? What role did they play that could have made, the white seculocrats, so uncomfortable about them? I think at the back of our minds, we have a number of articles that would have carried a political content about them. But my summation, the ways in which the media, represented that historical moment was actually to play it down. And one of the examples here is the Edelstein story. the Edelstein story should have been foregrounded, and it should have been given the kind of coverage that would have demonstrated, the capacity of black people to do to white society what they did to Edelstein. It actually closed that off completely. And this is something that would have served white society better and the supremacists better. In a way, it would have, it would have, what? Maybe not so much empowered as emboldened, black people. And that's the issue. Wellington Chazibani should have been, young people today, when we talk about Wellington Chazibani, it shouldn't be a surprise. If the media was playing the kind of role that we think it was playing, that it was actually, advancing the interests, of the oppressed people who were actually in a resistance mode.
Yes.
The media was not doing that at all. Instead, it was looking for ways in which to water down,
to dampen the fires,
to dampen it down. The Carlton Center blast, in and of itself, was a major, historical moment, and it should have. But there was an eagerness on the part of the media, to play that down. We go into 1977, the Solomon Mahlangu, episode, the Koch Street shooting thing. Within a week, it was off the newspapers. But at the same time, the newspapers did not generate a great deal of discussion, around the Koch Street shooting, a kind of discussion that at least would have been able to locate Solomon Mahlangu properly, within, or at least, if anything, to have salvaged Monty Mutloung out of this thing, because quite importantly, if the media was actually playing a very positive role, it should have centered around Monty Mutloung instead of centering around Solomon Mahlangu, because Monty Mutloung actually represents an articulation and expression of a black radical, kind of thinking and process. But that was actually played down completely. So it is my assertion here, that even if one looks at, 6 months leading up to Black Wednesday, there isn't anything remarkable that the media did, that should make it to have been the focus of attention, for the securocrats when they instituted Black Wednesday. The issue here is that Black Wednesday was meant to deal with the organizational infrastructure of the Black radical movement. The intellectual, kind of content will be dealt with later, but first deal with the organizations. And on the 19th, all 18 organizations were banned. What would then later come would be the reimagining, the institutionalization of the public sphere in such a way as to deal with any resurgence of Black radical thought. Not in the high schools, it will not happen. It will not happen in universities. It will also not happen in the workplace, because the profile of the workplace has also changed.
This is very, very, very instructive. So, in a sense, this substitute culture, this ersatz substitute culture. Could you elaborate? Do you understand what I mean? The substitute culture, the culture that has displaced the old location culture that they were attempting to institute in the 1980s. Some idea, of further elaborations, if you will, of its contours. Could you give a description? Yes.
The interesting thing here is that the reason why we probably had an opportunity, to look at the Gavian movement in the 1920s. There were lessons there. There were lessons to be learned just in terms of the idea of the love for the race, the love for the Black race. And I think I still emphasize the fact that this was the one, thing that actually came out of the mass movement of the 1970s, the love for the race. And when one looks into the 1980s, something that has happened here is that there has been a change in the ways in which people thought of themselves. And there was there was the creation of a new mindset, a mindset that was more inclined towards an individual advancement as opposed to being connected to the collective. I know this is not true for everyone, but the issue here is that on average, that is the understanding that we would have had. That the idea is not to be better than Tebogo next door, but that collectively we have a kind of a common struggle with whiteness. And that in itself, would have connected people to be closer together. That was an idealistic, kind of an understanding of that black radical movement at the time. But if you go into the 1980s, a completely new kind of mindset, is being instituted into the black mind. And that has to do with creating, in fact, think about it. In real terms, one of the things that I often talk about is that, and going up to 1976, we never had any barriers between neighbors. You could just go into your next door neighbor, past the kitchen, into the bedroom and talk to your friend. That was an open, kind of plan. But something was again introduced into black society, particularly in the urban areas. And we called it stop nonsense.
Yes.
And that's where, that should answer that in itself was actually creating a kind of a mindset, about your space being your space. And that certainly had an impact on what would have been the popular culture outside. No doubt the popular culture outside had elements of collectivism about them, but it is a kind of collectivism grounded on individuation. And this is something, it is again something that is being introduced, past the black radical movement. And it is something that institutionally we are being made to forget.
Very instructive. Would you have anything to say, my sister?
No.
Okay. Right on.
Okay.
Right.
I was hoping we get closer to where we are now.
Yes.
And what's playing out.
Oh, you mean the contemporary developments? Yes.
From 1992, I think I had a sense that what's unfolding was going to happen. And the difficulty of discussing what is happening now is if one was not part of the process from the very beginning. And what is beginning to happen now is that you do have a demographic in South Africa that embraced the new dispensation, that came out of 1994. And the biggest problem was that there was no kind of narrative that one was able to construct that could have, been on the other side of the divide. Because, the options were quite limited. You either spoke for the new dispensation or you were yearning for the old dispensation, and there was nothing in between. So for me, I'm caught up in that kind of a situation that at no stage did I ever embrace the new dispensation. And I know that a lot of people would probably say the same, but each one of us would have to be able to understand, and be able to explain, what aspects of the new dispensation were a problem. And I do think that I have been able to do that, in very many different kinds of contexts. But here is the situation here. When I talked about a kind of social engineering that happened, I think I also pointed out, that a lot of South Africans are going to find this quite offensive, but it's a historical reality that we have to deal with. the issue for me is that corruption, I know, if it is now, it is corruption that we need to talk about. My sense is that corruption is actually a paradigm issue. It is paradigmatic. Historically, there are particular organizations that come out of particular circumstances for whom it is inevitable they will become corrupt. And this is because they are able to attract investments, whether these are financial and material, but they are able to attract the investments. And inevitably, corruption is going to creep in. Now, in the South African context, what you have is a difference, at least in the 50s up to 60, is the difference between the ANC and the PAC. Now, the ANC is seen as being the realist, and it's an interesting term. The realist is an interesting term. What does it do? It opens the door for investments to come in, from outside, because you are realistic about the South African situation. You are saying South Africa belongs to all those who live in it. This is being realistic.
This is Dr. Gail Gerhard's nomenclature.
Yes, yeah. It's in fact, the historian Gerhard characterizes the ANC that way, that they are being realistic. But she doesn't add that this actually leads to the door being opened for investments, and this is true. If in 1950, it makes you a different person to be able to dine with Joe Slovo in Auckland Park. It's a difference. It's a difference of social standing. It's a difference of social class, and this is precisely the issue here. That over time, the gap still remains the same, but the materials of luxury that are available are becoming more exotic. So that by 2025 you actually need a boat. You need 10 properties. You need to steal R1 billion. It doesn't come as a surprise. Which is why I always argue that it is historical and institutional. It had been institutionalized at a certain point in the ANC's history, particularly in the 1950s. Because this is at that point that just in terms of the ability to attract material and financial investments, they are in a best place to do that, and they get that a lot. If you go into the 1960s, they still are. The PAC is not only getting any investments at all, but even if it were to do so, it would reject them, because this is where the problem is. There is no way the PAC could reconcile their ideology with any reception of aid, and any aid would take that form anyway. No, if someone talks about no strings attached, it's a myth, but that happens. So the PAC, historically, ended up being a poor kind of an organization.
Yeah.
People want to place the Black consciousness movement in a different kind of category, and want to attach a kind of elitism to it. But I always insist that I separate the intellectual class from the mass movement. And the mass movement was as grounded, as you possibly can be. And that's my interest in particular. Well, the intellectual class may well have been elitist, Mampela Rampela, he appears in Forbes lists, that sort of thing. But that is so counter Black consciousness. That's not what, at least not in terms of, its masses. Now we are getting to today. How then do we explain today?
In fact, just before you go, the Gail Gerhard, counterposes the realist and the rebel position, right? Isn't it? So I just thought this this ought to enter the frame.
In the context of the 50s too, that distinction becomes particularly interesting, because I think what Gail Gerhard is doing, she's actually mindful of where the SACP and Slovo are in relation to that question. Because immediately thereafter she actually discusses that. We are talking here 1958-59, going into 1960. The ANC is characterized as realist in that sense. The PAC appears in 1959, and Gail Gerhard says they are rebels. Now, I've already explained they are rebels because they take an extreme position. They are rebels because, you know, the kind of slogan is drive the white man to the sea. These are slogans that you would find, you know, being touted around in the 1950s and 60s. That is what makes the PAC, you know, more radical. And therefore, white people are not going to, you know, want, white people as well as Indians, non-Africans will not want to associate, you know, with the PAC for that reason.
At the base, I'm sorry to interject. At the base of it, it has to do with rejection or acceptance of white society as such, isn't it? So on one hand, there's a total rejection of white society that is being exhibited by the rebels, isn't it?
Yeah.
On the other hand, there's a willingness for pragmatic dealing with white society, and hence, yes.
Which in its extremity, it says throw the white man to the sea.
Yes.
But what is interesting about black radicalism in South Africa is that even that extremity is being denied by black radicals. That it is an extremity that is in the, you know, it is not, you know, the kind of extremity, for instance, that Sobukwe would have envisioned, you know, they would say.
Yes.
But be that as it may, the issue here is that if we are talking about the end of the 50s, this is where the rebels and the realist, you know, kind of labels come up. But the concern in white society here is about black politics. The concern is what in fact is happening to black politics. In terms of white politics, and Joe Slovo talks about this, he says, in 1948, National Party had a very slender victory. In 1953, it grew. In 1958, it was a landslide. And Slovo was saying white society is moving to the right, and that is concerning. But this is what Slovo, you know, wrote, and he wrote in the newsletter, he said, but white society should take comfort in the fact that we in the SACP have made sure that black politics do not move to the extreme left. Now, that answers the question. It has always been, the agenda, of white liberalism, as well as white radicalism, to put a stop to black politics going to the extreme left. And Joe Slovo admitted that much. But the issue here is we are coming closer to today. So in exile, the issue here is that in exile, once again, in terms of resources, it is the ANC that was receiving a great deal of resources from Sweden, from the UK, from the US, from NGOs across the Western world. The ANC was being given a great deal of, of resources, both material and financial. Also from the Eastern Bloc, the ANC was getting, lavishly,
endowed
and supported. It's only the Chinese, who were a little uncomfortable and, who were a bit ambivalent about their support for the ANC, because the ANC would certainly make claims of having aid from China. And we do know that, again, it was Yusuf Dadoo who went and had a meeting with Mao Zedong, and he was the first one out, to have that meeting with Mao Zedong. And we don't know what the details of it were and how much aid would actually come from China. But the ANC was well endowed, it had always been. On the African continent, you had puppet governments, such as you had in Lesotho, in Swaziland. The Lesotho government were actually puppets of the South African government. And the Liabua Jonathan government recognized the ANC over the PAC. But that was understandable. The PAC had close relationships with the Basotho opposition party, the Basotho Congress Party. That is why Liabua would have been so antagonistic, to the PAC. But even outside of that, the PAC wasn't, popularly received on the African continent.
I
Except
don't
for sure in Ghana.
I don't know, in independence Africa, surely.
Yeah, in Ghana.
All over, my brother. I'm just saying, I'm
Yeah,
kind of surprised
but
by
still,
that.
still, those African states,
The African
they were
states,
still
Africa,
reaching up to the Eng as well.
no. As a matter of fact,
What about Nigeria?
everywhere you go, it was the PAC that
Is it still
on the African, at least at the time, the PAC would have been far away ahead of the Eng in terms of their
But just
appeal.
in terms of the
It would have garnered.
resources, channeled to the PAC remained a relatively poor formation.
No, but I'm just saying the African Liberation Committee of the OAU insisted on equitable support, you see. And that in itself was against the ANC's pressures to do otherwise and be the sole and authentic representative. That was resisted. Do you see what I'm saying?
The ANC definitely backed the PAC, no doubt about it.
Well,
In fact, the issue...
The ALC, you're saying?
The ALC, yes.
Oh, yes, okay.
The issue then became, did the ANC walk away from the ALC, or did the ALC, boot out the ANC? Did the African Liberation Committee boot out the ANC? The ANC actually boasts that they walked away from the African Liberation Committee.
Yes.
That they were not actually expelled.
Right.
But other sources suggest that the ANC was expelled on account of its ideology. And this is when some of the very left-wing radical formations on the continent were particularly concerned about the outcome of the Morogoro conference. And in fact, one actually commented and said, the ANC, the masses in South Africa, it was like the black masses being shepherded by a white, sheepdog. A mass of black sheep being shepherded by a white sheepdog. And that is when Slobo was elected to the Revolutionary Committee's Executive Committee. Yes, the ANC was well endowed in exile, so that when they came back into the country, no doubt, as a governing party, they then had access to the national purse. But the issue here is that, that was going to be a continuation, of the exile culture. This is not something new. Access to these material resources and their embezzlement was not something new with the ANC. The one thing that we don't actually talk about much is the relationship that Oliver Tambo would have had with Tiny Rollins and the kind of lifestyle that Tiny Rollins actually afforded Oliver Tambo. It is a question of the lifestyle, and that in itself, was the kind of lifestyle that would have been emulated by other leaders of the ANC. So when you think of the ANC in exile, in terms of its leadership, the kind of lifestyle that is being sustained by the national purse was still being sustained by in exile by other sources, and those sources, we have mentioned, the NGOs across the Western world, were actually making huge donations to the end.
What you're insinuating is that if you're going to be a realist and pragmatist, there surely would be a payoff that you'd expect accordingly, isn't it? I'm just saying you wouldn't indulge in your realism and pragmatism if a payoff wasn't, didn't come along with it. So the payoff, you are saying, has always been an instrumental impetus, you see, in terms of ANC praxis.
But the issue here is that South Africans seem to think, and this is the one thing that we have to leave South Africans with. The corruption in the ANC does not begin with the Eng being a governing party.
Yes.
The fundamentals of corruption in the ANC are historical and institutional. And you go back to exile and that's where it all began.
Okay, thank you very much.
So the next episode